You're a therapist. You're a psychologist. Why has everybody gone insane?
Man, I mean, there's the title of your next book.
Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. You know, we all have those kind of humiliating experiences where you get home and you start thinking, oh, wait, what did I say? One of those experiences happened to me many years ago now, when I had just done a previous iteration of this podcast called Signposts at the time about the question of the Enneagram. And that night, I was over at my friend Andrew Peterson's chapter house, and he introduced me to several new people who were new to me, who were in the room. One of them named Ian, who said, I liked that podcast on the Enneagram. And I stood there and sort of explained and walked through the Enneagram. And it wasn't until I get home and I had a bunch of books that were on the Enneagram that I had consulted as I was doing that podcast. And I look down and I see Ian Morgan Cron, Ian Morgan Cron, Ian Cron. And I realized here I was at that place explaining to the world's expert on the Enneagram about the Enneagram. And I felt like an idiot. But graciously, after that, we became friends, and he has never held it against me. And so today, what I hope is that we have sort of the kind of conversation that he and I will have when we're walking around Radnor Lake on an afternoon, and let you listen in, because there's a lot that's going to be really shockingly helpful to you. And the reason I say shockingly is because one of the things we're talking about is Ian Cron's new book called The Fix: How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. And I know that when you hear, oh, wait, we're talking about the 12 steps, we're talking about AA, well, that means that's geared towards somebody who has addiction issues. And you may say, I don't have addiction issues, and so I don't need to listen. You will be wrong. Because what this book does is to show that the things that Ian learned through AA actually have application to everybody. As he says, whether you're well-adjusted, down and out, in between, probably more of us down and out than well-adjusted these days. And I want to explore that too. Ian, thanks for being with us today.
Russell, it's a blast every time I'm with you. So I've been looking forward to this for a couple of days now.
Before we talk about the things that you learned in writing this book, you're a therapist, you're a psychologist. Why has everybody gone insane?
Man, I mean, there's the title of your next book. Man, there's a confluence of so many pressures and stressors in the world where people feel out of control and uncertain at the same time. Mm-hmm. That typically in psychology is a recipe for, really losing your mind, right? So let me just explain that. We have these 4 quadrants, right? And one quadrant is, if you have low control but high certainty, right? Mm-hmm. You're on an airplane, You don't have any control over the airplane, but you're 99% sure you're going to get where you're going, right?
Yeah.
Now, the moment it hits a lot of turbulence, you leave that box and you go to the low certainty, low control place, right?
Yeah.
And that's when people panic. And I think we just live in an environment where people feel low certainty, no control, and I think it sends them into a tizzy.
There's kind of competing views about this, and we've kind of heard both of them on this show in different times. One of them would be we're in a time of unique stress for various reasons, and this leads to a lot of anxiety and depression and other things. There are other people who will say, "Well, we're living in a time that's not uniquely stressful. I mean, compared to dealing with hookworm and housing foreclosures widespread and Great Depressions and things like that. It's not that it's kind of unprecedented affluence in a lot of ways right now. But we tend to medicalize everything, and so you have people who are kind of going through normal life, but feel like they have to have a diagnosis for it, and that kind of contributes to the losing control. Which of those viewpoints is closer to what's real?
Well, there's no doubt that we pathologize things that are often just normal, right? I
Mhm,
mean, they may be uncomfortable, but they're just part of what it means to be a human being, right? Anxiety is both a curse and a blessing, right? If you didn't have anxiety, you and I wouldn't have survived on the Serengeti 10,000 years ago. You know what I mean?
mhm,
Like anxiety has a function, right? And if it just needs to be stewarded well, we've lived through many seasons, not only as a country but as a world of terrific anxiety. I think we're just in another trough of it, and it doesn't help that people like labels, diagnoses, because it gives them a sense of mastery or control over the situation.
mhm,
It's usually a lot messier than any single label can describe. And here's one thing I know in the middle of this, and that is that we need each other, that
mm,
we need community. And when you feel overwhelmed by the state of the world, move from the universals to the local situation. Do what you can control over. If
mm,
if you're feeling overwhelmed, then go volunteer at a soup kitchen or somewhere where you can make a difference, right?
mm.
I think people feel like nothing I say or no matter what I feel, it's just not changing the world. And go do something. And this is just good therapeutic advice, right? Go do something you have control over and make it a service to others. Be of
Yeah.
service because that's why we're here.
I was just reading this week. It's been a long time since I have seen this letter. I'd forgotten about it, but somebody posted it on social media, and it was Karl Barth writing to Dietrich Bonhoeffer when Bonhoeffer moved from Germany to London. And Bart writes and just rips him to shreds and says,
Mm,
"Your house is on fire in Germany. You're needed here. Why would you go and leave?" And it's just this really kind of motivating, invigorating sort of word of
mm,
rebuke from Bart. And it was right for Bonhoeffer to come back to Germany. Obviously, I think we would all say now. But how do you how does somebody know? I mean, there's a sense in which what Bonhoeffer could say is, "I've been saying the same thing over and over again. Nobody's listening to me. I'm not having any sort of effect. So I'm going to go to the local to England and just do what's best for me." How do you know when sort of resolving I can't control this larger situation is an escape from responsibility and and when it's just a wise choice? That's a
yeah,
hard thing I think to discern, isn't it?
yeah, it sure is. Thinking about my 12-step community, right? We have, of course, Reinhold Niebuhr's great prayer, the Serenity Prayer,
Mhm.
in which he says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now,
Mhm.
that's pretty brilliant, right?
Yeah.
And just because, acceptance doesn't mean endorsement, right? It doesn't mean accept the things I cannot change is sort of resignation, right? It's not that at all. There are lots of things I have to accept that I don't endorse,
Yeah.
right? Just reality wins 100% of the time. This is how it is,
Yeah.
right? And so, but it's up to me to change the things I can. And for me at this stage in my life, I'm much more focused on the person right in front of me.
Hmm.
What can I do to help this person? How can I be of service in this moment? What does love require of me in this moment, right now?
Hmm.
And because it's so easy on social media, and if you read the news and doom scroll, it's just this feeling of powerlessness,
Yeah.
this feeling like I can't stop the momentum of Eden from continuing downhill at 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Or,
And
or as
and
or as Merle Haggard would put it, are we rolling downhill like a snowball headed for hell?
yeah, right. And it's like, no, maybe, but what can I do?
Right.
Right? Like in this moment, what can I do? Well, before I got on this call, I prayed, God, I just pray that something that we say in this moment, that I would love Russell well in this conversation, and that we would say something useful for people who are listening.
Hmm.
Just do the next right thing, like that's what I'm trying to do every day.
In this book and in other places, in talking about your own grapple with addiction, you talk about your dad.
Mm,
And I found it really fascinating. I was looking again at an excerpt this morning in which you're talking about your dad being in the sort of position in the intelligence world where he was sort of pretending to be a drinker,
mm.
and then it came true. Can you tell us what that was about?
Yeah. So, my dad was a very complicated person. He was an alcoholic and a prescription drug addict, but he worked in the intelligence services for many years, on and off. And we were living in London at the time. My dad was part of the London station in the 1950s, 1960s. So you can imagine what that was like.
Mm.
That, as my dad used to call it, the Wild West. And toward the end of his life, he said to me, he said, and I think it was a veiled apology. He said, when I would go to events at embassies and parties and things like that, I was told to, kind of come off as the Playboy American drunk type, that
Mm.
nobody would take seriously. And
That
that way
Bruce
people would
Wayne
say,
persona
yeah, and
to
then
yeah.
yeah, and then people would say things in front of me thinking I was a harmless, kind of buffoon, right?
Mhm.
And whether that was true or not, I don't know. Maybe that was his take on what happened. But yeah, he was a very complicated person, had a tremendous impact on my life. And it took me many years to, I don't know, sort out all of that. But I think I've arrived at a place of peace and reconciliation with him.
John Mayer has that song talking about his family dynamics, and it's will it wash out in the water or is it always in the blood? And it's
Mm.
about how do I get. Is there a way to transcend whatever's been handed down to me? When you found yourself moving into addiction, did you think at the time, "Oh, I'm starting to go down a path I've seen before," or were you, kind of oblivious to that at the time?
A friend of mine likes to define denial as the refusal to know what you know,
Hmm.
in the moment, right? Like you both know it and don't know it at the same time. And part of the difficulty with addictions is that it's the one condition that will, well, as people oftentimes say, it's the one disease that will constantly tell you that you don't have a disease.
Hmm. Mhm.
Right? Diabetes doesn't do that. Tuberculosis doesn't do that. Right? But addiction has just this, and it's very slow moving. Right? So it's almost like being on the beach and watching the tide come in, and you don't notice that it's coming up until maybe it's over your head. And
Mm.
then you go, oh, wait a minute. And I actually know people who, even when it's long been over their head, they still don't see it.
Yeah.
Right? And people have a hard time understanding that, but it's actually quite true.
Well, in the book, you talk about addiction, and you talk about it in a much broader sense than just alcohol, drugs, the things that we typically think of,
Mm.
about the kind of pull toward addiction on all kinds of things. How do you define addiction in a way that's not just the way that we in popular discourse will say, "Oh, I'm addicted to chocolate," or whatever. How do you
Yeah.
define it?
Well, first off, like the great psychiatrist Gerald May once observed, to be human is to be addicted, and to be addicted and human is to stand in need of grace. So
Hmm.
I just don't know anyone who's not an addict, right? I just don't. And and I get very little pushback from people about that. Everyone can say, yeah, there are things that I do repeatedly that do not serve my interests, but I can't seem to stop. You
Yeah,
know, um, sounds like Paul, doesn't it?
yeah,
Why why can't I stop doing the things that I don't want to do? Why can't I do the things that I want to do? We just find ourselves in the glue of repetitive self-sabotaging. We did, I guess we can say, sinful behaviors that don't serve me or anybody else. All to say, I think it's a universal condition, right? The way I would define addiction is as a unhealthy, compulsive relationship with a person, a behavior, or a substance that has mood-altering effects and negative consequences.
a
So,
person, a
yeah,
behavior, or a substance.
hmm
How
that
does
has
that
mood
work with a
altering effect and negative
person?
consequences. Yo, absolutely. That's what codependency is called.
Mm,
Um, if you have let's say a child who has a drinking problem, let's say, and you find yourself just you can't stop thinking about them, you can't stop rescuing them, you can't stop enabling them, you can't stop
mm,
giving them money, you can't stop getting them out of jail. You can't. That's an addiction. Like
mhm.
that.
Yeah,
Right? Like, and it provides pain relief in the moment, but it has negative consequences, right? So people think of all the people you've counseled over the years that are in relationships that are very destructive and they
yeah,
can't seem to get out. There's some mood altering effect, there's negative consequences. And though I never like to recommend that two people separate in a marriage, I mean, I've just been in a situation where I'm like, that is the best of two bad choices.
yeah.
Um, because you're in an addicted relationship with somebody, and people have that all the time.
I have heard over the past several years, I noticed when it first started happening that I would hear from pastors who were talking about members of their congregation, and these happen to all be men, who had fallen in love with their chatbots.
Hmm.
And, the pastors would say, "This is not the sort of thing I'm trained and equipped for in this brave new world." But it was very difficult, even though these men knew this isn't a real person, but it was able to kind of read back the prompts that this person would give in a way that they could kind of escape into the fantasy of it for a little bit. And one of the things that I would kind of press and ask, well, what's going on here? And in all of those cases, they weren't trying to escape a bad relationship. It really wasn't that they were trying to get away from their spouses at all. It was that they were trying to get away from just something else in their lives, the boredom or the tedium or the pain or something. And that seemed to just give them a little, like you said, a momentary sort of pain relief that made things worse.
Yeah, they were looking for a fix,
Yeah.
right? They're looking for a fix, and human beings are kind of wired for that because we are aversive to pain, discomfort, and we're drawn to pleasure, right? The problem is when an external solution to an internal problem never works, right? Like it's kind of like going to the hardware store to buy bread. You're shopping in the wrong place,
Hmm.
right? Happiness, peace, joy, um, all the things our hearts yearn for are inside jobs. They're just not going to be solved by becoming a workaholic, right? Like how many people do you and I know in ministry, out of ministry, it doesn't matter, right? They are addicted to their work,
Yeah.
and they actually need a program of recovery to get over that. Um, And we know people who are compulsive people pleasers who just don't know how to say no. They can't say no. It's where they derive all their self-esteem from, is being appreciated by other people. And it has an addictive quality. It has mood-altering effects and often devastating consequences for them. So we're all, kind of on the hunt for fixes. But I think what our tradition tells us is that always ends poorly for us. That there's only one source that will give us the peace and the happiness and the joy and the sense of certainty and control appropriately that we want to experience in this life.
If it's universal, if as you say, everybody's addicted to something, then can it be fixed? Or are we just trying to find a less dangerous thing to be addicted to?
Yeah. Well, I think we can have a daily reprieve
Mm,
from those things. But that requires something like a program, like the 12 Steps offers, to show us how to bring that reprieve online. Like the 12 Steps, is a kind of rule of life, right? I mean, if you do the steps long enough, as my sponsor likes to say, the numbers fall away and you're just sort of living the spiritual principles that are embedded inside of each of them.
mm,
And you're just drawing on the wisdom of them every single day. So every morning when I get up, I say a prayer from the Big Book of AA, which is, the seminal text of that 12-step community. It's the first thing I think of when I open my eyes in the morning now. And that prayer is, God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. And I love that prayer,
mm.
but particularly that relieve me of the bondage of self, because at its core, most addictions have an element of we want to be in control. We want to run the show. We want to be the star, the director, the producer of this really quite boring at times, predictable drama we call our lives,
Mhm.
and what the steps offer is a way to actually operationalize the gospel. Like it puts wheels on that thing and turns it from being just a set of beliefs into a lifestyle, into a practice. That's very clear. It's very simple. It's not easy, but it's quite profound. The inner genius of those 12 steps is quite profound.
You write about in the fix about how powerful AA meetings can be, and I know you and I have talked about this in another context about why churches rarely seem to have that actual kind of community that one finds in maybe the AA meeting that's going on in the basement of that church. And
Yeah.
Frederick Buechner said something really similar 40, 50 years ago. And why is that the case? Why are churches largely, with some exceptions, but largely not able to get to that sense of the ability to actually step out of the performance and actually to grapple with what's really there and to find community with one another.
Yeah. Well, part of what happens in those basements, by the way, there's a story in the book that I love. This guy, Gene, and you'll appreciate this. Gene was a pastor of a sizable evangelical congregation, non-denominational church, and he had a drinking problem, a secret drinking problem, as often happens, right? You and
Hmm.
I know plenty of pastors with secret drinking problems. So one Sunday he shows up sozzled for church.
Mm,
It has now progressed to that point, right? He's half in the bag and he's given a sermon. The elders figure out, oh my gosh, this guy's potted, and they usher him out. And instead of getting him help, which is what you would hope a church would do, that they would be compassionate, they would be gracious, they would be kind, they would be forgiving, they'd be understanding, that they would do all they could to be of assistance. They fire the guy, right?
mhm.
So I meet him in a church basement, not of his church, but of a different church. And he looked at me and he said, why is it that I have found more kindness, grace, understanding, empathy, and joy down here in the basement than I ever experienced upstairs?
Mm.
Now, part of it is, when you've been given the gift of desperation, right, and you have found a solution, and and you recognize that not only the steps but the community that practices it together is there to support you. So it's really interesting. In the book, I talk about my having had a relapse, right? Almost 4+ years ago, and that I didn't talk about it publicly. It was a personal information, and I was still processing it and working it through. And I shared this not long ago with a guy I've known for a long time. We're not super close, but he's a brother in the faith. And he looked at me with such disappointment and kind of scorn,
Mm.
like, oh. And he actually said to me, I always thought so highly of you.
Oh,
But
wow.
right. And I was like, well, that's what you get for being vulnerable. But I thought that is precisely the opposite of what I get from people in the rooms of the 12-step recovery rooms, right? It's the only place in the world you can walk in and go, I am a complete mess. I have completely burned my life down to the ground. I am ashamed. I am trying to dig my way out of the hole. And everyone like claps and says, we're glad you're here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And wouldn't it be great if our churches could actually get that spirit inside,
Do you
of,
think part of that is kind of testimony culture? I mean, I think about that person who said that to you. I think about a friend of mine who had pancreatic cancer. Nothing really could be done. Some things could be done to ameliorate it, but not to cure it. And he would often look to somebody else that we knew who also had pancreatic cancer, but had had it a few years longer, and would say, if he can make it, I'm going to draw inspiration from him. And I used to say, I just, if he were to die, it would just be devastating to my friend. Do you think that some of it is people are kind of, when they see somebody who's gone through something difficult and they've overcome it, they're able to look at that and say, okay, well, there's kind of the poster child for the fact that this actually can be fixed. And when you had your relapse, it's kind of like, oh no, that means that maybe there's not a fix for it. Do you think that's part of it? Is we just have this sense of, well, the way it ought to work is you have the hero's journey that encounters the dragon, slays the dragon, and then moves on, and the dragon never comes back. Is that part of it, do you think, in people's minds?
yeah. I mean, look, I look at my relapse now and I'm like, I think of it like in The Great Divorce, right?
Mhm.
There's that great scene where that slithering dragonish demon is sitting on the guy's shoulder and whispering in his ear, "You can't live without me. You can't live without me." Right? And this person is talking with an angel, and the angel keeps saying, "Why don't you let me kill that thing?" Right? Let me kill that thing. And he's like, "Oh no, I can't." He's very ambivalent. He's very tortured. He's torn. Can't imagine living without it. And then when he finally gives the angel permission to kill the demon on his shoulder, then suddenly this man who previously had been like a wraith, like see-through, had no substance, becomes enfleshed, embodied. And the demon or the little lizard on his shoulder becomes a beautiful steed on which he rides off,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
With great joy. That to me is a great picture of recovery. That's the story of my life. It's the story of my relapse. Listen, I had a misstep. I had a misadventure. Welcome to
Mhm.
this. Welcome to humanity,
Right.
pal. I mean,
Right.
just because you write books and just because you're this and just because you got a podcast and you've got readers and blah, 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 does that mean I'm not vulnerable to
Right.
stepping out of line? Of course. That's ridiculous, right?
Mhm.
And my job, by the way, at my age is to tell people, look, you know, these things happen. Here's a solution.
Mhm.
And so I think in the rooms too that there's this feeling that we get sick alone and we get better together, and
Mhm.
together we can do this. And I've seen transformation after miraculous transformation in those rooms, jaw dropping changes in human beings that I've just never seen anywhere else.
You mentioned a few minutes ago about the pastors. I told you one time when we were walking around Radnor Lake that I had a friend who was in an important ministry role in a denomination that is teetotaling, does not believe in drinking at all, who ended up with a very serious drinking problem that I'm convinced if he had been able to say, "Hey, I think I might have a drinking problem," he could have been helped.
Yeah.
But if he had said that, it would have been, well, if you're drinking at all, it would have been like the pastor that you were talking about. He would have just immediately been fired. And so instead, what he had to do was to say, okay, well, I've got to get this on my own, and I'm going to do that. So let me just work on getting this taken care of and not tell anybody about it until it's fixed. And that was a disaster. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things that you're saying in the fix is that part of the community that you've seen taught in AA and that you've seen work in other places are the kinds of places that I don't want to say lower expectations because that's not what it does, but that has a sort of a grittily realistic view of what it's like to have a lifelong struggle as a human being and and is able to kind of free a person from the need to put the persona on while trying to work
Hmm.
on it on your own. Is that
Yeah.
an accurate reading?
Yeah. I wish everybody had a community like this where they can go and be, I like with that word, grittily real about their lives. But where they, and this is really important in 12-step meetings, we don't focus on the problem, we focus on solutions.
Mm,
That's kind of a mantra. And what's really interesting to people when they go to meetings, and you should come to one with me sometime. I think you would think it's the best thing ever, right?
mm,
Like people are first of all surprised at how much laughter there is in the rooms. There's not a bunch of glum people sitting around going, "I'm just trying to figure out,"
yeah.
I mean, we have our tearful moments, but there's actually a lot of hilarity. And our friend Kurt Thompson says it
Yeah.
so beautifully. He says, laughter in the rooms of recovery is proof that addiction doesn't get the last word. God does,
Huh.
you know? And, I'm always amazed at how much joy and hope and resilience and determination are in those rooms. The other thing that amazes people is we don't sit around talking about how not to drink or not to drug or not to overeat or not to overwork or not, we just don't
Really?
focus on that.
So
No, we do
it's
not.
not kind of, here are some things that I've found to work for me, go
Well,
and do likewise?
if there are newcomers in the room, that often goes in that direction to just be helpful to them, you
Mhm.
know. Um, that's a lot of work you do with a sponsor, which is a mentor in the program who helps you along through the steps and gives you advice based on their many more years of experience, right? But man, what people are working on in those rooms is how to become more loving, tolerant people of character,
Mhm.
to be people who are no longer egocentric, but now theocentric, people who are God centered and want to live lives of purpose and joy. And that's a lot of what we talk about,
Mm.
is just that. It's interesting you should ask these questions because I went to a meeting this morning and the whole topic of conversation was around what's called one of our traditions, which is has to do with our being such an inclusive community. And I don't mean that in the way we hear the word inclusive now. Sometimes we roll our eyes, but
Yeah.
I mean genuinely open armed to everybody, right? And there's a story from a long time ago, early in the days of AA, when a guy showed up at a meeting, and the AA was a year old, and they were just trying to figure out how does this thing run. And there was only two meetings in the whole world. One was in
Mm.
Akron, Ohio, and the other one was in New York, right? And this guy shows up at the door, and he quote unquote, this is so human, right? It's like they wanted to start setting standards for who gets in here, because this guy was clearly below their standards. And I'm like, that's so funny that a bunch of alcoholics are sitting around trying to figure out who's acceptable.
Yeah.
And they're all worried that if we let this guy in, it's going to ruin our reputation, right? As though their reputations weren't already ruined at this
Right.
point, right? And we're always doing this, right? Like it's almost like, well, who can we exclude to make ourselves feel better,
Yeah.
you know? And so anyway, one of the meeting guys in the meeting, and of course, the 12 steps derive from a Christian tradition, the Oxford movement. And so this guy looks at, they're trying to figure out, should we let this guy in or not? And this guy just looked at them all and he said, well, what would the master do?
Hmm.
And mic drop,
Yeah.
everybody goes, got to let him in. And again, there's that spirit of broad welcome, and to with humility and kindness to welcome all. We do put up we do make the bar high sometimes.
One of the things I think that some Christians that makes some Christians uneasy with AA. I was sort of re-looking over this morning the 12 steps, and it starts with dependence, and then a reliance on a higher power or God as you understand Him, and that's several times through there. And there are some Christians who would say, well, "Isn't this kind of what Christian Smith called moral therapeutic deism? It's a very fuzzy, non-specific kind of God rather than the personal God of Jesus Christ." How do you think about that sense of unease?
I just tell people to breathe. It's like because here's the deal, right? Like what Bill Wilson, the founder of AA and the author of the 12 Steps, co-author of the 12 Steps, said was, look, yes, we derive from a Christian background. However, we want to democratize and make available to people who do not identify as Christians the opportunity to find healing, to save their lives,
Hmm.
right? Now, Russ, I've met many, many people who came in the door as agnostics or atheists and eventually found their way to faith,
Hmm.
and this is just basic gospel stuff, man. Like seek in the door, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you, right?
Hmm.
People who have no belief open themselves up to a higher power, and oftentimes they discover the God of our understanding, right? They discover Christ. Others don't. But here's what I know. Is it possible that God shows up incognito sometimes in people's lives? This is now getting to Karl Rahner a little bit, right?
Hmm.
Like, I think to myself, I just can't explain the miracle. This person was written off as done for. And now I'm sitting with somebody who's had a more visible, tangible transformation that I've oftentimes never seen in the lives of people who aren't in this category. Um, Surely, when I see love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control arising in somebody, I just have to believe that God is present somehow, and I don't have to judge it. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
I don't have to judge it. I just have to cheer it when I see it. And I've had so many conversations on long walks with friends in 12-step recovery who come to me literally and say, I don't know who my higher power is. I know it's there. I can feel it. And I just get the beautiful opportunity to share with them, well, let me just tell you from my own experience what that might be. And it leads to a beautiful conversation about God as I understand him through the lens of my relationship with Christ. So, these are topics that I can speculate about. All I know is that God seems to show up powerfully in people's lives when the door of willingness to believe opens a little bit, as we're instructed to do in these programs, right? Like just open the door of willingness to God. And what you may discover is that you cross this beautiful meridian or line into a realm of faith that you didn't know existed before. And so, I mean, I understand people's anxiety
Hmm.
about like, well, we got to name it as Jesus, like, or otherwise it's not legit. It's like, okay, well, I don't know, except, I feel a little bit like the guy in scripture who's like, look, I don't know. All I know is that, now I can see, I can walk
Hmm.
or whatever. It's like, how do we explain that?
Yeah. One of the things I think that even people who who are listening to this, who, when you say everybody is struggling in some way with addiction, even the person who says, well, I don't know how that's true for me or if that's true for me. I think even those people would say there's one aspect of AA you talk about in the book that they actually can immediately see, and that's regret and the need to make amends. I don't think there's anybody who has lived a certain amount of life that doesn't look back and say, "Ugh," at the things that I have done in some way and the people that I've hurt. But a lot of times they're thinking, well, but what can I do now? I mean, I can't go back and unring the bell. What have you learned looking at these models through AA and other places about how to start doing that? How to deal with people you've hurt and regret, while at the same time recognizing I can't go back in time and undo all this.
Hmm. So the steps could really be broken down into a very simple formula, right? Steps 1 to 3 are about making peace with God. It's all about the admission of powerlessness, that on our own, our lives become unmanageable. And we can swap that word out with intolerable, whatever word we want. And having this seed of faith that maybe there's someone in the universe who cares enough about me and wants my best, right? I'm going to turn my life over to that power. So making peace with God. Then steps 4 through 7 are about making peace with yourself, right? Taking a hard, honest look at your life, doing some inventory work, sharing with another person. By the way, this is all gospel principles. That's all this is. It's just gospel principles, right? And then 8 and 9, to your point, it's about making peace with others. And that has to do with literally making a list of all the people we have harmed and becoming willing to make amends to them all. And then making direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others,
Mm,
right? And so part of our program is we got to go back and sweep our side of the street. I have sat down and had immense conversations with my children, with my wife, with people I work with, where I've had to sit down and go, I failed you at this point.
mm,
And I ask your forgiveness, and I'd like to know if there's anything I can do to make it up to you. You know, you know what? 90% of those times, as hard as those conversations are and awkward as they can be, they end so beautifully 90% of the time.
mm,
Sometimes they don't. Sometimes people are so angry with us they don't want to talk to us. And
mhm,
then we know we've done what we can to sweep our side of the street and keep it clean. And we just pray that at some point there would be reconciliation or a warming of the heart that would allow for a relationship to be brought back online between you and that person. This is just gospel stuff, man.
mm,
And
mhm.
there's people out there. I know very few people who don't have a fairly long list of people that they've harmed that they would
Yeah.
like to go make restitution to. It's not hard. Make the list and go do it.
Mhm, mhm.
Right?
But
And
but I
do
think
it.
I think the word that you mentioned there is huge in people's minds, and that is the awkwardness of that. It
Yeah.
just feels really weird to have that
But
kind of conversation.
how is that possible as Christians that we could feel that way?
Mhm,
Right? I mean, I agree, but then I think to myself, how could we feel that way? If you show up at the temple and you know you have outstanding business with somebody, immediately leave the temple and go reconcile with them. This
mhm,
should just be part of our normal vocabulary. We should normalize amends conversations with each other, right?
mm,
Like, if I've hurt you, I I'm just going to own my part of it. I'm not going to take your inventory and tell you what your part in it was. That's up to you if you want to do that or not. But I'm just going to own my part of it and do what I can to restore that which has been ruptured as a result of my participation in something that made it go sideways. So, I mean, uh, and by the way, we draw on the steps all the time. Like the 10th step is continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. And so I've just also learned as part of my program, the moment I do something that I know has been hurtful, I pick up the phone. I go back to the store where I was curt with the woman behind the counter,
Mm-hmm.
not taking into account her pain, her life, what's going on for her. I
Mm-hmm.
just go back and make things right. And these are just things that we should do as people of faith, right? It's like, this is a no-brainer. And yet, often what gets in the way is pride. It's not awkwardness. The awkwardness is pride and shame. And the
Mm-hmm.
only way through that, the only way out of that is through that, right? Like, you're just going to have to go, you know. And by the way, what's so great about making an amends is sometimes it feels so awkward that you won't likely make that mistake again.
Yeah, it's a deterrent.
It's a
Yeah.
deterrence, yeah. But
But
it's a good one.
I was talking to a friend not long ago who had been in a conflict with someone, and he was, maybe 10% responsible. I mean, I think any objective person looking into it say, "Yeah, like 10% of the problem was yours, and about 70% was the other person's, and then about 20% is just life." And he tried to make amends with this person, or to reconcile with this person, and it didn't go well because the other person didn't say, "Yeah, and I also have done these things." It was, "Yeah, you're right. You were awful." And so this person just came away thinking, "How have we actually reconciled when, we've agreed to my part of the problem, but it was defined as being the whole thing." Is that
Well,
really reconciliation?
yeah, well, I think your friend kind of went into it with some criteria for what reconciliation looks like that may not be completely accurate. I mean,
Mm,
look, um, I have no control over other people's experiences. I have no other, of things. I have no control over their behaviors. I really don't. I mean, how other people respond, what they do, I have no control over it. When I try to think I have control over it, I make a mess of stuff, right?
mhm,
My job, and sometimes reconciliation can't happen, but what can happen, well, let me say this: you can be reconciled but not restored to relationship with somebody,
yeah,
right? And when you go into an amends conversation, your mindset shouldn't be, and I can't wait to hear you apologize in return,
mhm,
right? It's just, you own what's yours, nothing more. You make no commentary on the mistakes they made. Oftentimes, you're making an amends will open them up, and very often people will say, "Yeah, well, I had a piece of it too,"
mm.
and that happens a lot. But sometimes you do run into somebody that just can't own their piece in it, and when that happens, you give thanks that you were able to do what you could do in that situation, and then you let it go. You just have to let it go.
One of the things, Ian, that we do to close out these episodes is to ask somebody to think about, if you were going to be on a desert island for the rest of your life and you have 5 books of the Bible to choose, what are they?
Oh, 5 books of the Bible.
But I'm not.
Oh,
I'm not going to do that with you. I'm not
oh,
going to do that with
good.
you, because instead,
Because you're worried I don't know 5 books of the Bible.
no, 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 no. No. Instead, what I'm going to do is to ask you for each Enneagram type,
Mm.
what book of the Bible you would
Ah!
recommend to that person for a lifetime on an island by themselves. And so, for people who don't know what the Enneagram is, let's just kind of give a very quick description of what each of them is kind of like, and why you would choose that book. Number one, what's an Enneagram one?
They're called the improvers, and the core motivation, conscious, unconscious motivation, is a need to be good, and that often plays out as a desire to perfect themselves, others, and the world.
Hmm.
Twos are called the helpers. They have a need to
Well, let's wait.
meet.
Let's stop. Let's wait with one.
Okay.
What Bible book for the one? Yeah, you can only have
Well,
one.
yeah, I mean, probably Galatians.
Ah,
Just thinking about grace, and for ones, often grace is a struggle, when they're not very healthy.
hmm,
I could also probably as a corrective to their need for order, recommend the Book of Revelation, just because
Mm-hmm.
it's so chaotic, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, you're just going to have to live with the chaos here, and just like,
Yeah.
let that be a flooding experience for you.
Twos.
Yeah, twos. Hmm.
Yeah, well, what are
Well,
they first?
twos are called the helpers, and they have a need be to be needed. They have a need to meet the needs of others, like this inner pull to, like, man, I just, and sometimes when it's unhealthy, that giving is strategic and calculated, because what they're trying to really to do is to win the appreciation of others, which supports their kind of fragile self-esteems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the Gospels are great for everybody, but particularly that story about Martha and Mary, right?
That's what I was just
You've got
thinking.
these two sisters, one who's clearly a helper, and the other one who looks like a 9 or a 4 on her knees at Jesus's feet,
Mm-hmm.
just looking up, not doing anything, just being, not doing. And that's a parable I often put before twos to consider. They're both doing the right thing. They're
Mm-hmm.
just one is just doing the right thing at the wrong time,
Yeah.
and twos have to discern that.
Threes.
The achievers. These are people who have a need to succeed, to appear successful, and to avoid failure at all costs. What would be good for them? Well, in some ways, what threes have to work on is this belief, this getting this message through their skulls that things are going to happen with or without them. It's okay. They don't have to be productive efficiency hounds that are doing, out there crushing it for their own glory and their own success. Philippians would be good for them. I'm just thinking about Philippians 2, this God man who emptied himself of divinity and didn't count it as something, just this idea of humility.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also recommend the first couple of chapters of Genesis to them. It's like things are going to happen with or without you. Okay.
Yeah.
Like the world God is going to keep creating with or without you. And so you don't need to be always working to prove your success and value in the world.
The type that is both you and me.
Yeah,
Fours.
the romantics, sometimes the individualists, right? So fours are really driven by this core belief that there's something essential missing in their makeup, and that without it, that they're never going to belong in the world because everyone else seems to have it. Moody, self-absorbed, melancholy, disproportionately represented in the creative arts and creative fields. And their need is to be special and unique as a way to compensate for what they perceive as the missing piece, right? Fours could spend a lot of time in the Psalms of Thanksgiving. First of all, they love poetry. Second of all, they need to have this corrective, right? Which is we fours often get addicted to their own suffering and their own pain, the story of how they lost that missing piece, And for me as a 4, like I have a spiritual practice every single morning, and I learned this in the rooms from the 12 steps, right? Every single morning, the first thing I do is I write down at minimum 3 things I'm grateful for. Otherwise, my attention immediately migrates toward what's missing and what's disappointing. So every day I start with 3 things I'm grateful for. And it could be this morning, one of them was my dogs, the hearth with the fire in it, my coffee, my beautiful wife reading, sitting next to me. I mean, just whatever it is, just begin with, here's what's present for which I am very grateful.
Fives.
The investigators, yes. Well, investigators are the most analytical number on the Enneagram. They are types that are driven by a need to escape up into their heads, into a very cerebral place, to minimize feeling depleted by being around too many other people, and to dampen their own needs, right? Emotional needs, even their own physical needs. and they're wonderful people, but often viewed as being aloof and kind of emotionally unavailable. Right? They're the most cerebral number on the Enneagram. You and I, twos, threes, and fours are the most emotional numbers on the Enneagram. Right? This is when we're starting to get into types that are really more up in their heads. I mean, a book of the Bible. I mean, they would try to think what would be a good book for them. Any
He-
book that.
Here's what I think, and I can't decide whether it would be better for the 5 or for the 3, and that's Ecclesiastes,
Mm,
about the
hmm
sort of the futility of performance and of wisdom when life is a vapor, and to kind of rattle a person out of the sense that I can get what I need exclusively in those ways.
Yes, vanity, vanity. All is vanity. Now, here's the only danger with fives in that. The number on the Enneagram that most is drawn to Nietzsche
Oh,
are fives. They
really?
can, oh yeah, fours and fives. They just, and unfortunately, they can think themselves into despair. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like,
Oh,
what's the
yeah.
point of anything? You know.
Yeah.
So I guess it would depend on the five and what kind of state they were in. You know,
Yeah.
because sometimes they can go down start to circle the drain on sort of nihilistic
Okay.
Philosophy. You
Well,
know,
then Ecclesiastes would not be the
yeah,
best for
probably not a win.
them.
Not a
Sixes.
win. Sixes, the loyalists, they're really their core motivation, or their deadly sin, if you will, really is fear, and they're driven by a need for security, certitude, and support. Um, and I just feel what I've been reading recently is I've been reading Malcolm Guite's translations of the Psalms.
Mhm.
And just reading those first 10 Psalms, I did think to myself, like yesterday, this would be really good for sixes.
Mm.
This knowledge that there's, as was written later, that there's no power that can separate us from the love of Christ, and to
Mhm.
know that in their bones and not keep looking to outside human sources for support and certainty, but to really recognize that you're already in good hands. You're
Mm.
already in good hands.
Maybe
Um,
maybe also, Exodus,
mm,
a sense of deliverance and protection even when one can't see that, in the
yes.
moment.
Yeah. Yeah,
Sevens.
absolutely. Sevens are the joy bombs of the Enneagram. They are people who are optimistic, sometimes toxically positive. Um, they're always looking for a new adventure, dreaming about a life of unlimited possibilities, um, and but really all in service to avoiding painful feelings, thoughts, or circumstances. So there's this kind of running away from life. And for some reason, I keep thinking of Romans when I think of sevens, right? It's
Mm.
such a clear eyed view of reality.
Yeah.
I mean, every time I read Romans 7, I just think to myself, where did he come up with that?
Yeah.
I mean, that is just extraordinary writing and thinking and wisdom, And we oftentimes say that what sevens need is their virtue that they should work toward is sobriety. Um, and James would be another good book for them.
Mhm.
Like just be more disciplined, be more focused, be clear eyed about who you are and what the world is like. Be joyful, be joyful, but don't confuse joy with just intensity.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. What do you think?
Maybe Proverbs.
Yeah, Proverbs would be another good one. Yeah.
Um,
I mean, there's so many different books we could pick from
yeah.
here, right? Like that have lessons for each type. The,
Eights,
you
but when
know,
we
the,
recommend it, hoping that they won't get offended and beat us up.
ah, well, I mean, some eights look like twos, which is funny because they have there's a type of eight that we call the social eight, and they're actually they are still forces of nature and bigger than life, but they also have this tough love side to them that's very protective
Mhm.
and wonderful. They're the coach that you love to hate and hate to love. It's like because they're for you so powerfully, and are there for you so powerfully. Um, Yeah, so eights are called the challengers, and they have a need to assert strength and control over others in the environment in order to mask vulnerability and weakness. And so any book of the Bible, like when Paul talks about, and you'll have to tell me the verse again because my brain is on pressure mode here, but I think about when Paul talks about this idea that, that there's power in weakness,
Yeah.
like leading with weakness. And at the risk of sounding self-congratulatory, I mean, when I was writing my book, I kept thinking, should I be this vulnerable?
Hmm.
Should I be this honest? And a really dear friend of mine who's a great therapist and a dear brother, he said to me, Ian, always lead with your weakness.
Mm.
And I think that's one thing that eights have to learn is to lead with vulnerability.
So maybe Second Corinthians.
Yeah, so maybe 2 Corinthians too, yeah.
And finally, nines.
Nines, the peacemakers. Oh, I love nines. I'm married to a nine. I'm dad to a nine. So nines are, easygoing, supportive, kind. They often look like twos on the outside. Kind of people who don't upset the apple cart very much. They're kind of low maintenance people for the most part. But they have a real need to maintain inner and external peace, and they want to avoid conflict pretty much at all costs. And if we were to go around the Enneagram, we actually could see that each of those types reflects a dimension of God's character, right? So one's the goodness of God, two's the love of God, three's the glory of God, four's the pathos and suffering of God, five's the wisdom or omniscience of God, six is the unfailing loyalty of God, seven's the joy of God, eight's the power and justice of God, and nine's the peace of God. Right.
Mm.
And unfortunately, when they get into when these aspects of of God collide with human nature, right, they can become distortions of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so in many ways, each type is a distortion of some aspect of the character of God. Right. And that was for free, Russell, all that wisdom right there in one shot.
That's good.
So nines, just needing to deal with conflict. And needing to step up to the plate and embody their lives fully. I don't know.
I think Ephesians for nines.
Tell me why.
Because you start with peace. God has made peace in Christ. And then it moves on to this call of, therefore, shake yourself awake, wrestle not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers.
Where's the passage about awake Israel, awaken, O Israel,
awake, O sleeper, and he will shine on you? That's Ephesians, yeah.
Yeah, well, there it is. You're right. It's Ephesians, because that actually is perfect for nines. Awaken, O sleeper, right? For the day is drawing near, right? Whatever, I can't remember the exact quote. You're the Baptist here. I'm the Episcopalian. I'm not supposed to know Bible verses off the top of my head. I never did. I never had to do scripture drills. You never
did sword drills in the Episcopal
no sword
church.
drills for us. We just went to Eucharist and then offered, and then followed by crustless sandwiches at the country club. But I do have a profound love for scripture, and I do think that, man, there's so much for each of our types to be mined in there as both as correctives and as encouragement to us.
The book is The Fix: How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. I have read it ahead of time. It's really good, and it went in all kinds of directions that I did not expect that were really helpful for me, and I think it will be for you as well. Ian Morgan Cron, thanks so much for being with us today.
Russell, let's go walking soon.
All right.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Will Dawson. The associate producer is Mackenzie Hill. This episode was mixed by Kevin Morris with video production by Abby Egan. Theme music by Lennon Hutton. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.